One of the best things I did to improve my photography was to set up my camera in a way that made it really difficult to take a bad photo. And so today I'm going to share with you my settings. And yes, you can use these settings on any camera, any brand, and pretty much any style of photography. So to get started, let's first talk about camera modes. If you don't already know, camera modes are different setups that your camera offers you as a way to help you expose and take photos. If you're just starting out, you've probably used or heard of auto mode, and this is a camera mode that lets your camera take care of everything, and all you need to do is press the shutter button. Alternatively, there are other camera modes, and different cameras will have a range of other options. But of the main camera modes, you've got auto, program, aperture, shutter, and manual mode. Some camera modes like auto take care of everything, and others like aperture priority let you take care of one setting. And so that's why personally I use aperture priority for my photography. I've spoken about this a little bit before, but aperture priority lets me control the aperture of my photos while my camera handles the shutter speed, the ISO, and everything else. Using aperture priority lets me focus on the one setting, the aperture, which I think is the most important because aperture controls depth in our photos, and as a travel and street photographer, I'm often taking different types of photos where I require different types of depth. If I want to take a photo of a portrait, I can stop down to f2, and if I want to take a photo of a landscape, I can stop up to f10 really easily. And so if you want a simple camera mode that still gives you some manual capabilities, I would recommend using aperture priority. But again, if you're just starting out, don't listen to a bunch of other photographers who say you have to shoot in manual. It's really not the case. Get used to auto, start enjoying photography, and go from there. So next, let's talk about focus settings. Personally, I like to use continuous autofocus because this lets my camera constantly look for focal points in my scenes. Compared to single shot and manual focus, I feel continuous is the perfect mix for me as a travel photographer because it's really fast paced. Within our focus settings though, it's also important for us to talk about focus modes. And focus modes are just an additional way we can control the focus and the settings of our cameras. Personally, I like to use zone focusing on my camera, but you might see wide or center focus modes on yours. The perk of using zone focusing is that with my joystick or the D-pad on your camera, I can move around a box which will tell my camera where I want to send the focus points to. This is fantastic for me when I come across a scene I'd like to photograph where there's someone or something I want to focus on in particular. Take this photo for example. I wanted to photograph this person jumping in, so I moved the zone focusing points to the right-hand side of the frame so I could capture the person jumping in the water. If I had my focus settings to something different, it might not have captured this person really sharp. It's also worth saying that if your camera can, I would always have eye autofocus turned on. This is with a lot of newer cameras, so if you do have an older camera, don't really worry about this. But if you do have a newer camera, leave that on because it's a really beneficial setting to have. Next, I think it's worth talking about a few simple set and forget settings. Now, I'm probably going to annoy a few photographers with what I'm about to say, but personally, I always shoot with auto white balance. On the rare occasion that I know I need to change my white balance for a particular reason, I would usually just rely on my camera's auto white balance setting. And often because I shoot in the raw function, I can usually correct it in post, but using auto white balance is just a set and forget setting that I really don't need to worry about. This isn't obviously the case for my professional shoots, but when I'm out traveling, having one less setting to worry about is really important. Another setting I like to keep on auto is my ISO. If you think back to when I talked about aperture priority does handle my ISO settings, but fortunately with Fujifilm cameras, I do get an additional level of customization with ISO. So I'm not sure about other cameras, but I know on Fujifilm cameras, I can set up different ISO brackets. So I can have an auto ISO 1 setting and like an auto ISO 2 setting. This just gives me the additional flexibility to customize my ISO settings. For example, if I'm photographing in the middle of the day, I'll use auto ISO 1 because the bracket is capped at ISO 400. Alternatively, if I'm photographing in low light situations, I'll use auto ISO 2 because I've got the cap set at 800. This is a really handy feature from Fujifilm cameras, so if you do know of other camera brands that do it, just let me know in the comments. The next set and forget setting would be image quality. I shoot in RAW and in JPEG mode. What this does is that for every photo I take, it's going to save a RAW file and a JPEG file to my SD card. The reason I do this is so I can send photos easily from my camera to my phone using the JPEGs. This is great for sharing with friends or editing on the go, but also having the RAW file so I can use later on in Lightroom Classic, where I like to process a lot of my bigger batches of images. I don't always edit on the go. I like to get home from a trip and look at my photos all together and start to create collections from there. So having the option to do both is a reason I love Fujifilm cameras. But if you have no intention of editing your photos with Lightroom Classic or other programs, I would just recommend keeping it in the JPEG setting. If on the other hand, you think you might want to edit RAWs down the line, just keep the setting I have switched on, the JPEG and RAW, so you do have that flexibility with photos whenever you want to get into it. The next really important thing I like to do with my camera setup is to use custom buttons wherever possible. Different cameras have different amounts of custom setting buttons, so go through yours and find which buttons you can actually customize. Having settings quick on hand is just another way to ensure our cameras are easy to use, photography is effortless, and to make it really hard to take a bad photo. The Q menu on my Fujifilm lets me set up different camera profiles, but if your camera doesn't have something like that, just look for different buttons that you can customize and add features like your white balance, your ISO, and stuff like that. Now, if you use flash or you have a flash on your camera and you'd like to use it, the settings can be a little bit confusing, so let me explain what I do. On my X100F, I have a built-in flash, and on my XE4, I have an additional on-camera flash, and I love to take photos of my friends and my travels when I'm out late at night. I like to experiment with the manual settings, so if you are shooting on-camera flash, I would usually recommend around 1/64, but if you're just starting out and you'd like to use your flash a little bit more, just set it to TTL. This is like your flash's auto mode, and it's a really simple and effective way of using your flash. And lastly, I use the My setting of my Fujifilm camera to let me easily access really important settings I use all the time. In my menu on my X100F here, I have autofocus mode, the image quality, white balance, ISO, auto settings, ND filters, and film simulations, pretty much everything we've gone over today. Now, not all cameras have a My menu settings, most do, but if yours doesn't, not to worry. What I would also look for is a function setting on your camera, and this is a really easy and effective way of doing something similar. Sony cameras have this on their function settings, and you need to go into your settings to customize that, but just take a look on your camera brand and I'm positive they'll have something similar. Overall, if we do a quick recap, the most important thing I find to getting perfectly exposed images is having a camera that's easy to use. So for me, I use aperture priority and continuous autofocus. Those two settings together really make it difficult for me to take a bad photo. And building off that, all of the other settings we went over, I make sure they're really accessible and easy to find so that if I do need to change them or customize them, I'm not spending too much time in my camera menu. The last thing I want to be doing is going through my camera settings when there's a scene in front of me that's only going to last a few seconds and I might miss it. So by making sure my gear is as easy to use and set up properly, I just give myself the best opportunity to take really great photos. So guys, if you have any questions about my camera setup, I'm positive that other people might share it. So just leave a comment below. Otherwise, just send me a DM on Instagram. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed and I will see you in the next video.